When a man looks at you, it's never just about what meets the eye. It's about what that detail stirs inside him. Your waist is one of those details he notices without even trying, almost as if his instincts are wired to pay attention to it. There's something about the waist that creates a silent invitation. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand attention, but it whispers in a way that keeps pulling his focus back. For a man, the waist represents closeness. It's not like the obvious allure of your lips or the boldness of your eyes. Instead, it's this subtle reminder of intimacy, of the possibility of being near enough to feel that curve under his hands. It becomes the unspoken fantasy of contact, of what it would feel like to close that small distance and claim a space that feels both delicate and powerful at the same time. When he imagines your waist, he doesn't just think about its shape, he thinks about the experience of reaching for it. That first moment when his hand finds its place that carries a different kind of electricity. It's the kind of touch that suggests connection before anything else. In his mind, it's the way to guide you closer, the way to show that he wants more without ever having to use words. The waist becomes the bridge between desire and intimacy, between what's seen and what's silently hoped for. Men rarely admit this, but the waist has a way of creating a fantasy of both tenderness and passion. On one hand, it's the spot where his protective instincts flare up. He wants to hold you there, pull you closer, keep you near. On the other hand, it sparks an entirely different layer of thought, the fantasy of pulling you into a moment that feels raw and consuming. This duality is part of what makes the waist so fascinating to him. It's delicate enough to symbolize closeness, but bold enough to symbolize something far more physical. That contradiction keeps the fantasy alive. Even in the smallest interactions, he notices it. When you're standing next to him and he sees the outline of your waist, his imagination is already running ahead. When you lean forward, twist slightly, or shift your weight, those movements magnify the shape in a way that feels impossible to ignore. And the more subtle it is, the stronger the pull becomes. That's the thing about forbidden fantasies. They don't need to be loud or exaggerated. They live in the quietest details, and the waist is one of the quietest yet most powerful details of all. The truth is, when men think about the waist, it's not just physical desire that comes alive. It's the idea of intimacy wrapped inside that attraction. To place a hand there is to claim closeness, but to imagine it is to want something deeper, a permission to connect, to be trusted, to be let in. That's why the waist becomes more than just a body part in his mind. It's a symbol of proximity, of vulnerability, of being allowed to close the distance that separates two people. And because of that, the fantasy is rarely spoken. It feels too revealing, too vulnerable for a man to admit how much it means to him. He'll talk about eyes, he'll talk about a smile, but the waist, that's harder to confess. Because when he admits that, he's not just saying he finds you attractive. He's admitting he wants to feel close, to hold you in a way that's far more intimate than casual. That's why, for him, the waist is always more than it appears to be. The curve of your hips carries a story men rarely say out loud, but one they replay endlessly in their minds. It's not just the shape, though the shape alone is powerful enough to capture his attention. It's what that curve represents to him: movement, rhythm, passion. The hips stir a fantasy that goes beyond a glance because they awaken something primal in him, something he can't always control. When he notices your hips, he's not just seeing, he's imagining how they move, how they sway, how they guide the dance of desire without ever needing words. It's instinctual, something written deep inside him. And it becomes one of those forbidden thoughts he may never share but never stops feeling. There's a reason the hips are tied so strongly to attraction. They symbolize fertility, life, and sensuality in a way that goes back centuries. And even though men don't sit around thinking in those terms, their instincts pick up on it instantly. When he sees the curve of your hips, it taps into both an ancient part of his biology and a very modern part of his fantasy. He thinks about holding them, about the way they move under his hands, about the rhythm they create when passion takes over. For him, the hips are not passive, they are active, alive, full of motion and promise. That's why they stand out, because they aren't just something to admire from a distance. They're something he wants to feel in motion, guiding everything that happens between two people. And there's something else hidden in that fantasy. Control. The hips represent a place where his desire for closeness meets his desire for dominance. In his imagination, holding your hips is about more than touch. It's about direction, about guiding you toward him, about the power of being in sync with you. This isn't about force, it's about connection. When he thinks about your hips, he imagines that perfect balance between leading and following, between passion and surrender, between strength and vulnerability. It's one of the most intoxicating fantasies he has because it's never just physical, it's emotional and primal at the same time. Even the smallest movements amplify this fantasy. The way your hips shift when you walk, the way they roll when you dance, even the subtle twist when you turn to reach for something. It all sparks thoughts he might try to push aside but can't ignore. Those movements become a silent language, one he understands instinctively, one that says more to him than any words could. It's in those tiny gestures that his imagination builds entire stories, moments of closeness that feel both natural and forbidden at once. What makes it forbidden is that it feels too raw to confess. If he were to say it out loud, it might sound too physical, too hungry, too much. But in truth, the fantasy isn't just about desire. It's about being swept into a moment where everything feels alive, where nothing else matters but the rhythm between your body and his. That's the fantasy he carries silently, the one that lingers in his mind long after he's looked away. And here's the part he'd never admit: behind that hunger, there's also admiration. Your hips don't just represent passion, they represent power. The power to captivate him, to disarm him, to make him lose his composure without even trying. He knows he's at the mercy of that curve, of that movement, of that silent call to desire. And even though he may never speak of it, that's exactly what makes the fantasy so intoxicating, because it's not only about what he wants to do, but about how powerless he feels in the presence of what your hips already do to him. There's something magnetic about the thought of placing hands on a woman's waist or hips. For a man, that image alone carries an entire world of fantasy. It's not just about touch, it's about what that touch symbolizes. When he imagines holding you there, it feels like a perfect blend of possession and protection, of closeness and control. The waist and hips are those rare points on the body where his instincts come alive. It's where he can pull you nearer, guide you, and feel like he's part of something far more intimate than just physical attraction. That's why in his mind, that gesture is never casual. It's loaded with meaning, and it fuels fantasies he doesn't always have the courage to voice. The act of holding you by the waist suggests ownership, but not in a crude sense. It's about claiming a moment, claiming the connection. In his imagination, his hands resting there are a signal that you belong with him in that instant, that the space between you no longer exists. It's a fantasy of closeness, of being allowed to touch a place that feels delicate yet powerful. The waist and hips become anchors, points that give him the ability to feel both your strength and your softness at the same time. And because of that, the fantasy of his hands there grows deeper the more he thinks about it. There's also something primal in the fantasy of possession. Men won't always say this out loud, but in their secret thoughts, guiding a woman by the hips or pulling her by the waist makes them feel a surge of dominance. It's not harsh or forceful. It's an energy that combines desire with leadership. It's that fantasy of directing the rhythm of a moment, of being the one to set the pace while knowing you're right there with him, responding, moving, breathing in sync. That sense of control excites him, but so does the vulnerability it requires from you. The fantasy becomes intoxicating because it isn't just about his power. It's about your willingness to let him hold you that way. What makes this even more forbidden is how often it plays out in his mind during ordinary moments. If he's standing close enough to imagine slipping his hands around your waist, that thought lingers far longer than he'll admit. When you lean in to say something, when you brush past him, when he notices the curve of your body as you turn, it sparks that unspoken urge to reach out, and in his imagination, he does. He doesn't hesitate. He closes the space, his hands settle there, and in that instant, everything changes. The fantasy is simple, but the emotions behind it are anything but. Beyond desire, there's a tenderness that comes with it. Holding you by the waist isn't only about pulling you closer, it's about keeping you there, about showing without words that he wants you near. It's a small gesture that carries the weight of protection, affection, and intimacy all at once. That's why this fantasy feels so powerful to him. It isn't just raw lust, it's the collision of passion and emotion, of hunger and care. That blend makes the thought irresistible, even if he knows he can't always act on it. And that's why men rarely admit just how much this fantasy matters. It feels too vulnerable to confess, too revealing of the fact that they crave not just the body, but the closeness, the nearness, the intimacy that comes with having their hands exactly there. It's not about being bold or obvious, it's about the quiet power of touch. The way it transforms a moment from ordinary into unforgettable. And in his private world of imagination, that's the fantasy he never lets go of. There's a reason men can lose themselves just watching the way a woman moves her waist and hips. Movement creates a language all on its own, one that speaks louder than words ever could. Even the smallest sway, the gentle twist when you walk, or the rhythm when you dance can spark a flood of forbidden thoughts in his mind. The hips and waist in motion are not just physical, they are symbolic. They become the stage where desire plays out silently, and for a man, that sight unlocks fantasies he may never put into words. The dance of seduction begins the moment he notices how your body moves, because in that motion he sees both freedom and invitation. It's not always about dancing in the literal sense. It could be the way you shift in your chair, the way you lean forward, or the way you stretch when you stand. Those so subtle gestures are enough to catch his attention because they draw out the shape of your waist and hips in a way that feels almost deliberate, even if it isn't. In his mind, it feels like a tease, like a secret performance meant only for him. That's what makes it so intoxicating. The hips have a rhythm that suggests passion, and when you move, he can't help but imagine what it would feel like to be pulled into that rhythm with you. The fantasy becomes alive in moments when you dance or sway, when the natural movement of your body creates a rhythm he wants to join. For men, the hips represent not just physical attraction, but the idea of synchronization. To follow your movements, to match them, to find that unspoken beat together. That's where desire grows. He imagines being guided by that motion, being caught in a rhythm that feels endless, where passion and connection blur into one. This is why so many men fantasize about dancing with a woman they desire, not because of the dance itself, but because of the closeness and rhythm it promises. And what amplifies the fantasy is the tease of what remains unsaid. Men often experience this attraction as a tension between what they see and what they imagine. Your hips move, your waist twists, and instantly, he's building a story around that movement. It's not just about the body, it's about the energy behind it, the way it makes him feel pulled in without ever being touched. That silent pull becomes a kind of seduction that lingers because it leaves space for him to fill with his own thoughts, his own longing, his own hidden desires. This is also why he thinks of your hips as more than just physical beauty. They represent the potential for passion to come alive. When you move, you're unknowingly giving shape to his fantasies of closeness, of intimacy, of being swept into a moment that feels beyond control. The dance of seduction doesn't require words, it doesn't require a plan, it only requires that subtle sway, that small twist, that natural rhythm that awakens something inside him. In his mind, it feels forbidden precisely because it's so natural. How could something so simple create such powerful thoughts? And yet it does. What he never says out loud is that he doesn't just want to watch that movement, he wants to join it. He wants to place his hands on your waist, follow your rhythm, feel the way your hips guide him. It's not just a fantasy of passion, but of connection, of finding a shared rhythm that feels intimate and alive. The forbidden part is how much this thought consumes him, how much he imagines it in moments when he should be thinking about anything else. But he doesn't stop himself because the dance of your hips and waist is too strong, too magnetic to resist. It's the kind of fantasy that lingers long after the moment is over, and that's why it never leaves his mind. What makes the fantasies about your waist and hips even more powerful is the fact that they are rarely spoken aloud. Men carry them like secrets, tucked away in the corners of their minds, because voicing them feels too raw, too primal, too exposed. There's a forbidden quality to these thoughts, and that alone magnifies their intensity. When something feels unspeakable, it also feels irresistible. The waist and hips hold that exact power. They awaken thoughts that feel almost too revealing to share, and so those fantasies remain locked inside, where they grow stronger with every glance, every movement, every subtle reminder. Part of why it feels forbidden is that the fantasies aren't polished or romanticized. They're not the kind of things a man can easily wrap in flowery words and casually drop into conversation. They're instinctual, unfiltered, the kinds of thoughts that feel too vulnerable to risk judgment over. He may say he likes your smile or your laugh, but he won't admit how much he imagines gripping your hips, pulling you closer, or losing himself in the rhythm of your waist. To admit that is to risk being seen as too hungry, too exposed, too honest. And so the silence keeps the fantasy alive, but silence also makes it stronger. What we suppress doesn't fade, it grows. The more he avoids speaking about what your waist and hips make him feel, the more those feelings turn into a private obsession. A man can walk away from the moment, but the fantasy doesn't leave him, it follows him. In his quiet thoughts, when no one else is watching, those images replay themselves. He imagines the curve of your hips under his hands, the pull of your waist against him, the intimacy of being close enough to feel every movement. It's in the secrecy that the fantasy becomes sharper, more defined, more consuming. And that's the paradox. The very thing that feels forbidden is what keeps it so magnetic. If men openly admitted these thoughts, if they were spoken casually and without hesitation, they might lose some of their fire. But because they remain unspoken, they live in the shadows of desire, burning brighter precisely because they are hidden. There's a thrill in knowing something is too bold to say, and that thrill feeds the intensity of the imagination. What makes this even more powerful is how natural it is. A man doesn't have to try to think this way, it happens automatically. He sees the sway of your hips or the curve of your waist, and instantly the fantasy is there, even if he tries to push it aside. The forbidden nature of it doesn't stop the thought. It only makes it feel more dangerous, more tempting. And while he may never say it, you can sometimes sense it in the way he lingers a little longer, the way his eyes hesitate before moving away, the way his body subtly reacts without him realizing it. At its core, the forbidden fantasy about your waist and hips is about desire that feels too real to share. It's not about surface level admiration. It's about a hunger that touches something deeper, something instinctual. Men know it might sound too much if spoken, so they keep it to themselves. But that doesn't mean it isn't there, burning, vivid, and alive every time they see you move. The secrecy keeps it powerful, and the power keeps it unforgettable. That's why, even when it remains unsaid, it never stops being imagined. What men rarely admit, even to themselves, is that the fantasies about your waist and hips are not only about desire. Beneath the surface of physical hunger lies something softer, something they hesitate to acknowledge because it reveals vulnerability. When a man imagines his hands on your waist or his body in rhythm with your hips, he isn't just fantasizing about passion, he's craving connection. That closeness symbolizes a deeper longing, one that ties intimacy and emotion together in a way he can't easily explain. It's more than lust. It's about being allowed to be close enough to feel trusted, to feel accepted, to feel part of something more than the physical. In his mind, the waist becomes more than a curve to admire. It becomes a place where intimacy begins. To hold someone there isn't just about control or attraction, it's about comfort, about grounding, about belonging. When he imagines pulling you close by your waist, what he really wants is for you to stay there, to not pull away. That's why the fantasy isn't only about passion, it's about permanence, about the hope that closeness can last longer than the moment itself. It's his way of imagining not just desire, but connection that lingers beyond the physical act. The hips carry a similar weight. Yes, they spark fantasies of rhythm and passion, but beneath that is a longing to be in sync with someone. When he thinks about the movement of your hips, he isn't only picturing desire, he's picturing harmony. He imagines being part of that rhythm, of finding himself perfectly aligned with you in a way that feels natural and effortless. That thought brings him a kind of comfort, because it speaks to more than his body. It speaks to his need to feel united with another person, even if he never admits that's what he truly craves. Men often hide this emotional layer because it feels dangerous to expose. It's easier to joke about physical attraction, to comment on beauty or curves, than to confess that the real fantasy isn't just about passion, but about closeness that feels safe. Admitting that would mean admitting they want more than desire. They want intimacy. They want vulnerability. They want the feeling of being let in. And for many men, saying that out loud feels riskier than keeping it hidden. So they mask it in silence, allowing the physical image to cover the emotional truth that sits beneath it. But the truth doesn't disappear. Every time he thinks about pulling you closer by your waist, what he's really imagining is the safety of knowing you won't step back. Every time he fantasizes about the sway of your hips, what he's really longing for is the comfort of being in step with you, moving together without effort. These images are not just symbols of passion. They are symbols of trust, closeness, and the desire to be more than two separate people. They are about becoming connected in a way that words can't quite capture. And that's what makes these fantasies both forbidden and beautiful. They start with desire, with raw physical hunger, but they end with something gentler, something deeply human. They reveal that men don't just crave bodies, they crave bonds. They don't just want to touch, they want to be allowed to stay. The waist and hips become the symbols of that secret longing, the places where passion and intimacy merge, where lust and love overlap. And though men may never speak it aloud, that's the truth that lingers behind the fantasy, that what they want most isn't just your body, but the closeness and connection your body represents.